There are promises that can never be broken, and there are wounds that refuse to heal. Thomas Morgan knew both better than any man alive. The snow was coming down heavy and silent, a thick white blanket trying to bury the world and all its sorrows. He stood before the gravestone, the Montana winter of 1868 stealing the breath from his lungs and turning it into a ghost. His hand, calloused and rough from a life of hard labor, traced the cold letters carved into the stone. Elizabeth Morgan, and beneath it, infant son. They never even had the chance to give the boy a name. The fever had come like a thief in the night and taken them both, leaving Thomas with nothing but a hollowed-out hole where his heart used to be. He knelt, his knees sinking into the snow, and placed a small wooden horse by the frozen, wilted flowers from his last visit. He'd carved it himself the night before Elizabeth went into labor. He'd sanded every edge until it was smooth as river stone, imagining it in the hands of a son he would never know. "I don't know how to do this without you," he whispered, his voice cracking in the frozen air. The only answer was the lonely moan of the wind through the pines. 15 years later, that same wooden horse sat on a dusty shelf in a cabin high on a mountainside, looking down on the town of Timber Creek. It was the spring of 1883. The cabin was sturdy, built by a man who understood the unforgiving nature of winter. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against a pale blue sky. Inside, Thomas Morgan moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be in a hurry. He was 45 now, his body still powerful, but his face was a roadmap of grief. Silver had crept into his dark beard, and his eyes held a permanent shadow. He was pouring coffee into a chipped mug when a sudden, frantic noise shattered the morning peace. He crossed to the window, his coffee forgotten. A murder of crows was circling his cabin, their cries sharp and panicked. Their black wings sliced through the air, stark against the morning sky. "Bad omen," he muttered, his hand reaching for his rifle out of pure, ingrained habit. The folks down in Timber Creek barely remembered Thomas Morgan was a man at all. To them, he was the mountain man, a ghost who lived in the high country, a name spoken in hushed tones. He only came down when the seasons turned, trading furs and herbs and small, intricately carved wooden animals for the few supplies he couldn't get himself. Most had forgotten he once had a wife, a woman named Elizabeth, who walked through town with her hand on his arm, her belly swollen with promise. Even fewer knew what the doctor told him after she was gone, that the old war wound in his side, the one that ached with every winter storm, had ensured he would never father another child. His family line started and ended with him, a single lonely point in history. He finished his coffee and glanced at the calendar. It was time for his spring trip to town. He pulled on his worn boots and a heavy coat. The mountain held on to its winter chill long after the valley had surrendered to spring. As he stepped outside, the crows scattered, their warning cry swallowed by the vast empty sky. He didn't know it then, but their warning wasn't for a storm or a predator. It was for him. Timber Creek hadn't changed much. A main street, a general store, a saloon, and a small church. Just a handful of buildings fighting to keep the wilderness at bay. He tied his mule to the hitching post outside Sullivan's general store. Old Man Sullivan was out sweeping the porch, a ritual as predictable as the sunrise. "Well, I'll be," Sullivan grunted, leaning on his broom. "Thomas Morgan, down from his mountain. Spring must be official." Thomas gave a slight nod, his face an unreadable mask. "Brought some carvings to trade," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "Need flour, coffee, salt?" Sullivan nodded, but his eyes drifted toward the church at the end of the street. There was a small crowd gathering there, an unusual sight for a weekday morning. "Heard about the auction over at the church?" Sullivan asked, his voice dropping. "Not horses this time, Thomas. Not livestock." Thomas stilled, his hand hovering over the leather satchel filled with his carvings. "What do you mean?" Sullivan leaned in closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Children." The word hit Thomas like a physical blow. A cold, hard knot formed in his stomach. "Orphans," Sullivan clarified, seeing the look on Thomas's face. 3 of them. Siblings. Parents died last winter. Some woman from the orphanage in Riverdale is conducting it. Says she can't keep them all. Too many mouths to feed since the mines closed. Thomas felt the world tilt on its axis. They're, they're selling children? Sure, he asked, the words tasting like poison. Sullivan shrugged, looking uncomfortable. Calling it placement with compensation. Same thing they've been doing since the war. Say it's better than sending them to the factories back east. Thomas didn't say another word. He turned, leaving his mule, leaving his satchel of carvings, leaving a stunned old man Sullivan on the porch, and walked toward the church. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if he were wading through deep water. The crowd in the churchyard wasn't large. Maybe 20 people, mostly men looking for cheap labor, their wives standing beside them with pinched, unhappy faces. They were all facing the church steps, and on those steps stood a stern-faced woman in a gray dress, and behind her, 3 small, terrified figures. Thomas stopped at the edge of the crowd, his breath catching in his throat. The oldest was a boy, maybe 6 years old. He stood ramrod straight, his thin shoulders squared like a soldier, trying to shield the other 2. Beside him, a little girl with a mess of tangled hair clutched the hand of a toddler, a tiny thing with eyes so big and dark they seemed to swallow her pale face. Their clothes were worn thin, their shoes didn't fit, and they shivered in the lingering morning chill. The woman in gray, Mrs. Holloway, cleared her throat. Her voice was sharp, brittle. 3 mouths to feed, she announced to the silent crowd. All siblings, ages 6, 4, and just barely 2. No known ailments. They must stay together. She gestured to the children behind her without even looking at them. William is strong for his age. Sarah is quiet and obedient. The baby Mary is healthy enough. A man near the front called out, "What's the starting price then?" Mrs. Holloway's mouth tightened into a thin, hard line. $2 for the set. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the churchyard. $2, the price of a decent shovel. Thomas watched the boy, William, grip his sister's shoulder, his small jaw set with a fierce determination that no child should ever have to possess. He was protecting them, even here, even now, with nothing but his own small body. Anyone? Mrs. Holloway's voice grew sharper, laced with impatience. $2 for 3 strong children. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Thomas saw the look of resignation on her face. He saw her glance at the waiting stagecoach, the one that would take these children to be split up, sent to separate workhouses, their last connection to family severed forever. And then it happened. The little one, the toddler Mary, looked up. Her gaze swept across the crowd, past the curious faces, past the pitying stares, and landed directly on Thomas. Her eyes locked with his, and in that moment, Thomas felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pity, it was something else. A jolt, a shock, a sense of recognition so profound, it felt like he'd been struck by lightning. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he knew this child. $3. A deep voice boomed across the silent churchyard. The crowd turned. It was his own voice. Thomas stepped forward, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. He reached into his coat and pulled out 3 silver dollars, nearly half of everything he had. He held them out, his eyes not on the stern-faced woman, but on the 3 small children huddled behind her. $3, he repeated, his voice as steady as the mountain he called home. William's eyes narrowed, full of suspicion. Sarah's grip on her sister tightened until her knuckles were white. But Mary, the tiny girl with the impossibly old eyes, just stared back at him. And in her gaze there was no fear at all. The transaction was sickeningly fast. A piece of paper, a scratch of a pen, the clink of coins. And just like that, Thomas Morgan, the man who had spent 15 years building a fortress of solitude around his broken heart, was standing at the edge of town with 3 silent children. His children. The thought was so absurd, so impossible, it almost made him laugh. William squared his little shoulders, his chin jutting out defiantly. "We don't bite," he said, though a slight tremble in his voice betrayed his fear. "Didn't figure you did," Thomas replied quietly. Sarah, the girl, studied him with sharp, suspicious eyes. "You got a house?" Thomas nodded. "Got food?" He nodded again, slower this time. He looked down at the smallest one. Mary still hadn't said a word. She just watched him with those eyes, those knowing, unsettling eyes. It felt like she was looking right through him, seeing all the broken pieces he kept hidden away. "Best get moving," he said finally. "Mountain trail gets dangerous after sunset." He lifted them into the small supply wagon one by one. He was struck by how little they weighed, like birds. William flinched when Thomas's hands touched him. Sarah kept a protective arm wrapped around Mary the entire time. Their worldly possessions fit into a single small bundle, a change of clothes, a worn Bible, and a faded ribbon. The journey up the mountain was silent. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic plodding of the mule. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken questions. What had he done? He, who had failed to protect his own wife, his own child. What right did he have to take on 3 more? He knew nothing about raising children. He only knew how to be alone. He glanced back. William sat bolt upright, his eyes scanning the forest like a scout on patrol. Sarah's back was ramrod straight, her face a mask of stoicism. And Mary was leaning against her sister, her thumb in her mouth, her big dark eyes still fixed on Thomas. Watching, always watching. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. He helped them down from the wagon. William immediately placed himself between Thomas and his sisters, a tiny, defiant guard. Sarah's eyes darted around, mapping out the terrain, looking for escape routes. Mary simply stared at the cabin, but she wasn't looking at it with fear or curiosity. She was looking at it with a strange sort of familiarity, as if she were coming home. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice rough. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. "Not much, but it's warm. It's solid." The inside was Spartan and clean. A stone fireplace, a cooking stove, a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs. A ladder leading to a small loft. His own bed was in the corner, separated by a curtain that hadn't been drawn in 15 years. The children stood huddled in the doorway, refusing to step inside. "You can sleep in the loft," Thomas said, moving to light the fire. "There's room enough." William gave a single curt nod, his eyes still wary. "Where do we put our things?" Thomas paused. He hadn't thought about that. He hadn't thought about any of it. "There's an empty trunk up there. You can use that." He busied himself with the fire, then moved to the stove. He felt their eyes on his back, 3 pairs of eyes judging him, weighing him, deciding if he was a monster. He made a simple meal of porridge and dried berries. He set the bowls on the table. "Eat," he said. "Must be hungry." They approached the table like frightened deer. William helped Mary into a chair that was too tall for her. Sarah hesitated for a long moment before finally sitting down. They ate in a tense, unnerving silence. After the meal, he showed them the loft, a simple space with a large straw mattress and clean folded blankets. He'd built it years ago, back when he still believed in a future, back when he thought his house would one day be filled with the noise of a family. "Outhouses around back," he said, feeling more awkward by the second. "I'll be down below if you need anything." William nodded, already arranging their meager possessions in the trunk. Sarah was inspecting the roof beams. Mary just stood there watching Thomas. "Thank you," William said suddenly, the words forced, as if they cost him a great deal of effort. "For the food and for taking all of us." Thomas didn't know what to say. "Get some rest," he managed. "Morning comes early on the mountain." He retreated down the ladder, his heart pounding in his chest. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat in his worn leather chair, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers. What had he done? What madness had possessed him? He glanced up at the loft. He could hear their soft, quiet breathing. In sleep, they looked like what they were, just children. William's arm was thrown protectively over his sister's. Sarah's hand was clutching Mary's. And Mary, she was sleeping with a faint smile on her face, as if she knew a secret the rest of the world had forgotten. A door in his chest that had been rusted shut for 15 long years creaked open, just a crack. He looked at the framed portrait of Elizabeth on the mantel. Her gentle eyes seemed to watch him, to question him. "Elizabeth," he whispered to the silent cabin, "I think you sent them to me." The embers popped and hissed in reply. And upstairs in the darkness, 3 small hearts beat under his roof, but he had no idea what those hearts were hiding. He had no idea the trouble he had just invited into his life. He thought he was saving them. He would soon find out. They might be the only ones who could save him. Morning came quietly, creeping into the cabin like an unwelcome guest. Thomas woke with a start in his chair, his neck stiff, his boots still on. He blinked, and his eyes immediately found the three small figures curled up on a blanket near the hearth, where the fire had long since died. It wasn't a dream. They were still here. William was the first to wake. He sat up, instantly alert, his eyes scanning the room. When he saw Thomas, a flicker of surprise crossed his face, as if he'd expected to wake up and find the mountain man gone. "There's work to do after breakfast," Thomas said, his voice low as he moved to restart the fire. "If you're staying, you help." William's jaw tightened. He gave a single, solemn nod. "I can work." Thomas looked at the boy's skinny frame, the fierce determination in his eyes. He had no doubt that he could. By the time the girls were awake, breakfast was ready. More porridge, but with a drizzle of honey this time. A small luxury. Sarah's eyes widened, though she tried to hide it. Mary climbed into her chair, her movements unnervingly precise for a toddler. "What kind of work?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with the same suspicion she wore on her face. "Goat pen needs mending," Thomas answered. "Garden needs turning. Chickens need tending." "I can do the chickens," Sarah offered immediately. "I'm good with animals." Thomas nodded. "Good. William can help me with the pen." He paused, looking at Mary, who was watching him with those strange, knowing eyes. "Mary can stay where we can see her." Outside, the air was crisp and clean. Thomas handed William a small mallet and showed him the broken plank on the goat pen. He watched as the boy studied the damage with a focused intensity that was years beyond his age. "Need to remove the broken piece first," Thomas instructed, "then cut a new one to fit." William took the mallet and went to work with a practiced ease that startled Thomas. The boy had done this before. His hands, though small, knew their way around tools. It was a skill learned, not taught in an orphanage. It was a skill taught by a father. The thought sent an unexpected pang through Thomas's chest. They worked in a comfortable silence, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the hammer filling the morning air. Thomas noticed how William copied his movements exactly, a small shadow learning the ways of the mountain. Then Sarah emerged from the cabin, dragging a broom twice her size. She began sweeping the porch with a furious energy, muttering about dust and lazy boys. Thomas had to bite back a smile. She was trying to create order, to carve out a space for herself in this strange new world. A few moments later, Mary appeared in the doorway. She toddled down the steps, her eyes fixed on Thomas. She walked right up to him, stopping at his side, and just stood there. She didn't speak, didn't reach for him. She just stood, a silent, tiny sentinel, as if this was her rightful place in the world. Thomas felt something catch in his throat. He looked down at her, at the top of her messy-haired head, and felt a wave of confusion and something else, something he couldn't name. The morning passed this way, in a strange, unexpected harmony. The goat pen was mended, the porch was clean, the eggs were gathered, and for the first time in 15 years, Thomas Morgan prepared lunch for 4. The heavy silence from the day before was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of shared work. "You did well today," Thomas said as they ate. The words felt foreign on his tongue. William's eyes went wide with surprise before he quickly masked it. "Thank you, sir." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "My name is Thomas." Sarah glanced between them, her fork halfway to her mouth. Then she asked the question that had been hanging in the air since they arrived. "How long can we stay?" Thomas put down his own fork. He looked at each of them. At William, trying so hard to be a man. At Sarah, so desperate for control. At Mary, the silent observer. "As long as you need to," he said, the words feeling truer than anything he'd said in years. "This is your home now, if you want it to be." William's shoulders visibly relaxed. Sarah's eyes narrowed, as if searching for the catch, the trick. But Mary, who had been methodically eating a piece of bread, looked up at Thomas, and she smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. a small, genuine curve of her lips that transformed her solemn little face into something bright and luminous. It lit up the dark corners of the cabin and the even darker corners of his heart. But that wasn't the strangest part. As she smiled, her eyes weren't looking at him. They were looking just over his shoulder, at the empty chair beside him, the fourth chair at the table, Elizabeth's chair. Days began to bleed into one another, each one marked by the rhythm of the mountain and the slow, cautious thawing of three frightened children. They were building a life, piece by piece. William became Thomas's shadow, learning how to track, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to split wood without losing a finger. He was a quick study, hungry for knowledge, for the skills he would need to protect his sisters. Sarah took over the cabin with the authority of a tiny general. She organized the pantry, waged war on dust, and coaxed green shoots from the cold garden soil with a gentle patience Thomas hadn't known she possessed. And Mary remained an enigma. She followed Thomas everywhere, a silent, constant presence. She rarely spoke, but her eyes missed nothing. Sometimes Thomas would catch her humming a strange, tuneless melody to herself. Other times he'd find her staring intently at the empty corner of the room, her head tilted as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. He tried to dismiss it as a child's imagination, a coping mechanism for the trauma she'd endured. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. One evening, as Thomas was on the porch mending a fishing net, Mary came and sat beside him. She held something out to him, her small fist tightly clenched. "What's that?" he asked gently. She opened her hand. Lying in her palm was a tarnished silver locket. Thomas's blood ran cold. It was Elizabeth's. He had buried it at the very bottom of his trunk, wrapped in her favorite shawl 15 years ago. He hadn't seen it, hadn't touched it, since the day she died. There was no possible way Mary could have found it. The trunk was heavy, locked, and hidden in the darkest corner of the loft. "How?" he started, his voice a choked whisper. "How did you find this?" Mary didn't answer. She just placed the locket in his trembling hand. "She's pretty," Mary said, her voice startlingly clear. Thomas stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Who is pretty, Mary?" Mary pointed, not at the locket. She pointed to the empty space on the porch swing right next to Thomas. "The lady," she said simply. "The one who watches you. The one with the baby." The world stopped. The air grew thick and heavy, and the sound of the wind in the pines seemed to die away. He had never told them about Elizabeth. He had never, ever mentioned the son they had lost. The portrait on the mantel was small and faded, her features hard to make out in the dim cabin light. And the locket was empty, save for a tiny curl of Elizabeth's dark hair. "What lady, Mary?" he forced himself to ask, his voice barely audible. Mary frowned as if the question was foolish. "Your lady," she said. "Elizabeth. She says you're doing a good job with William. She likes it when you teach him to carve." Thomas couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He was a practical man, a man of wood and stone and iron. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. But this was impossible to explain. How could she know her name? How could she know about his carving, a private, solitary act of remembrance? He looked at the empty space beside him, and for a terrifying, heart-stopping second, he thought he could almost see the impression of someone sitting there. He looked back at Mary, but she was already gone, distracted by a moth fluttering near the lantern, her strange pronouncements forgotten as quickly as they were spoken. He was left alone on the porch, the cold, heavy locket in his hand, and a chilling realization dawning on him. He hadn't just bought 3 orphans. He had brought something else home with him from that auction, something ancient and unexplainable. And he was beginning to suspect that Mary, his silent, watchful Mary, was not just a little girl. She was a key to a door he had thought was locked forever. And he was terrified of what might be on the other side. That night, sleep offered no escape. Thomas was haunted by Mary's words, by the impossible knowledge she held in her tiny head. He found himself watching her as she slept, this strange, otherworldly child who seemed to exist in 2 worlds at once. The next morning, the sun rose on a world that felt different, altered. The familiar mountain landscape seemed to hold new secrets. He decided they needed a distraction, a return to normalcy. "Time I taught you how to fish," he announced to William, whose eyes lit up with excitement. As they were gathering their makeshift poles, Sarah came running from the direction of the chicken coop, her face flushed, her eyes wide. "Thomas, come quick," she shouted. "It's happening." He followed her, his heart pounding with a nameless dread. What now? What other strangeness was this day going to deliver? But it wasn't strange. It was a miracle. One of the hens was surrounded by a dozen tiny, fluffy yellow chicks, peeping and stumbling around her. The pure, uncomplicated joy on Sarah's face as she counted them was a balm to his frayed nerves. It was a simple, beautiful thing. A reminder that life, in all its forms, goes on. William's hand found his small fingers gripping Thomas's with a newfound trust. "Can we still go fishing after?" he asked. "Yes," Thomas said, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "We'll still go." It was in that moment of peace, of simple, ordinary happiness, that he saw it, a rider coming up the trail. Visitors were rare on his mountain. Uninvited visitors were unheard of. He instinctively pushed the children behind him as the man drew closer. He was riding a fine horse, not the tired nags usually seen in Timber Creek. He wore a clean coat and a silver badge that glinted in the morning sun. It was the town sheriff, a man named Blackwood. A man Thomas had only seen from a distance. A man with a reputation for being hard and unyielding. Blackwood reined in his horse a few feet away, his eyes sweeping over the cabin, the yard, and finally the children half hidden behind Thomas. His gaze lingered on them for a moment too long, a cold, calculating look that made the hair on Thomas's arm stand up. "Morgan," Blackwood said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of steel. "Heard you made a purchase in town." "They needed a home," Thomas said, his voice low and steady, his hand resting on the handle of the axe he'd been using to chop kindling. Blackwood's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Is that what you call it? I heard you paid $3 for the set. A bargain, I'd say, unless there's something wrong with the merchandise." His eyes narrowed, pinning Thomas in place. "I'm here about their parents. Their deaths were unusual. We're still looking into the matter." Thomas felt a knot of ice form in his gut. Sullivan had said it was a fever. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Thomas asked, cutting through the pretense. Blackwood leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Those children, they saw things. Things they shouldn't have. They're witnesses." Thomas's grip tightened on the axe handle. "Witnesses to what?" The sheriff's cold eyes flicked to William, then to Sarah, then lingered on Mary, who was peeking out from behind Thomas's leg. "To a tragedy," Blackwood said smoothly, but his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a wolf circling its prey. He looked back at Thomas, the fake concern gone, replaced by a clear, undisguised threat. "They're more trouble than they're worth, Morgan. They belong with the county. You'd be smart to hand them over to me. For their own good, of course." Thomas looked from the sheriff's cold, dead eyes to the three small children pressed against his legs. He saw the terror in William's face, the defiance in Sarah's, and he saw Mary. She wasn't looking at the sheriff with fear. She was looking at him with recognition. And in that instant, Thomas knew. This wasn't a sheriff coming to protect three orphans. This was the monster from their nightmares, come to finish what he started. "They're not going anywhere," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together. He took a step forward, placing himself more firmly between Blackwood and the children. Blackwood's cold smile returned. "Have it your way, old man. But don't say I didn't warn you. Some things are best left alone." He wheeled his horse around and rode back down the trail, leaving a heavy, poisoned silence in his wake. Thomas stood there for a long time, watching until the sheriff was out of sight. The fishing trip was forgotten. The morning's simple joy had evaporated like mist in the sun. He turned to the children. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with a fear that was old and familiar to them. "Who is he?" Thomas demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. William flinched, his gaze dropping to the dirt. Sarah shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin white line. Mary just stared at the empty trail where the sheriff had been, a single tear rolling down her cheek. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sounded like a threat. Thomas sat in his chair by the dying fire, his rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the door. He had brought them here to be safe, but he had led the wolf right to their door. Sometime after midnight, he heard a noise from the loft, a soft shuffling. He grabbed the rifle, his heart pounding, and crept to the base of the ladder. He peered up into the darkness. He could just make out their silhouettes in the faint moonlight. They were huddled together, and William was tying their few belongings back into the small bundle they had arrived with. They were going to run. He climbed the ladder, his movements slow and deliberate. They froze when they saw him, like startled rabbits. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice a quiet whisper. William straightened up, trying to look brave, but his trembling gave him away. "We have to leave. He'll come back for us. We can't bring trouble to you." "You're not trouble," Thomas said, the word surprising even himself. "You're family, and we don't run from monsters. We fight them." He sat down on the edge of the mattress, the rifle resting against the wall. "You have to tell me everything, William. You have to trust me." William looked at Sarah, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He took a deep breath, and the story came tumbling out. Their parents hadn't died from a fever. They had been prospectors, and their father had made a big strike, a hidden vein of gold deep in the mountains. But his partner, a man he trusted, a man with a silver star and cold eyes, had wanted it all for himself. There was an argument, a fight. Their mother had tried to intervene. William's voice broke. He had our father's eyes," he whispered, tears finally streaming down his face. "The man who came today, Sheriff Blackwood, he's the one. He was there that night. He's the one who hurt them." Thomas felt a rage build inside him, a white-hot fury he hadn't felt since the war. This wasn't just a corrupt lawman. This was a murderer. And these children weren't just witnesses. They were the only thing standing between Blackwood and a fortune. But there was a piece missing. If Blackwood killed their parents, why hadn't he found the gold? How could the children know where it was? "Where is it?" Thomas asked gently. "The gold?" William shook his head. "I don't know. Papa never told me. He said he hid the map somewhere safe, somewhere no one would ever think to look." Suddenly, a small, quiet voice cut through the darkness. It was Mary. Her eyes were wide open, but they weren't looking at any of them. They were staring at the rough wooden wall of the loft, as if watching a memory play out. "Papa is scared," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "The bad man is coming. Mama's crying." Thomas, William, and Sarah all froze, listening to the toddler speak in full, clear sentences for the first time. "Papa has the paper," Mary continued, her voice a monotone chant. "He folds it up. So small. So small. The bad man is at the door. Papa gives it to me." Thomas's blood ran cold. "He tells me to hide it," Mary whispered, her eyes still unfocused. "Hide it where the heart is. He puts it inside the bear." William gasped. "The bear!" He scrambled to their small bundle and pulled out a worn, much-loved wooden bear, its features smoothed down from years of handling. It was their father's carving, the only toy they had left from their old life. Thomas took the bear. It was light, clearly hollow. He found the faint seam along its back. With a twist of his knife, he popped it open. Tucked inside, folded into a tiny, tight square, was a piece of oilskin. He carefully unfolded it. It was a map. And at the bottom, drawn in a child's clumsy hand, was a picture of their cabin, Thomas's cabin, with an X marked on a spot just a few hundred yards from the back door, by the old lightning-struck oak tree. Their father hadn't just struck gold anywhere. He had struck it on Thomas Morgan's mountain. He must have been using the cabin as a landmark, planning to come back for his family and the gold. But Blackwood had found him first. The chilling realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. Blackwood wasn't just coming back for the children. He was coming back for the map. He was coming back to his mountain. And he knew they were here. Just as Thomas looked up from the map, his mind racing, a sound from downstairs shattered the night. Crash! The heavy sound of the cabin door splintering, being kicked in from its frame. A beam of light from a lantern cut through the darkness below, followed by a familiar, chilling voice. "I knew you had it," Blackwood snarled. Now, are you going to bring my map down here? Or do I have to come up there and take it from your corpses, just like I did with your parents? Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through the loft. William let out a small, terrified gasp. Sarah stifled a sob. But in Thomas, something else ignited. The grief, the solitude, the 15 years of frozen-over emotions. It all melted away, replaced by a pure, primal rage. This man was not going to take anything else from him. "Stay here," Thomas whispered to the children, his voice deadly calm. "And stay quiet, no matter what you hear." He grabbed his rifle. It was old but reliable, just like him. He moved to the edge of the loft, peering down into the main room. Blackwood stood in the center of the cabin, the shattered door hanging off its hinges behind him. He held a lantern in one hand and a gleaming Colt revolver in the other. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the empty chair by the cold hearth. "I know you're up there, Morgan," he yelled, his voice echoing in the small space. "Don't be a fool. You can't protect them. They're cursed. Their mother was some kind of witch, always talking to things that weren't there. And that little one? She's just like her. Give me the map, and I'll let you live." Thomas knew it was a lie. Blackwood couldn't afford to leave any witnesses this time. He raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. But Blackwood was smart. He kept moving, using the table and chairs as partial cover, the lantern light dancing and creating confusing shadows. It wasn't a clean shot. Thomas needed a different plan. He was on his mountain. This was his home. He knew every creak, every shadow, every loose floorboard. That was his advantage. With a sudden, swift movement, he kicked the oil lamp at the edge of the loft. It tumbled over, crashing onto the floor below, and instantly extinguishing Blackwood's lantern. The cabin was plunged into absolute darkness. Blackwood cursed, firing a wild shot into the ceiling. Splinters rained down near Thomas's head. "You think darkness is your friend, old man?" Blackwood hissed. "I can play this game all night." Silence. The only sound was the wind howling through the broken doorway. Thomas moved silently across the loft, his bare feet making no sound on the rough-hewn planks. He knew Blackwood would expect him to come down the ladder, so he did the opposite. He moved to the far corner, to the spot where the roof met the wall, where he knew a single beam offered a precarious handhold. He listened. A floorboard creaked near the fireplace. Blackwood was moving toward the ladder. Now. Thomas swung himself over the edge of the loft, his calloused hands gripping the beam. He hung there for a second, a dark shape against the slightly less dark wall, then dropped silently to the floor below. He landed in a crouch behind his bed, the rifle held ready. He was now behind Blackwood. The sheriff was at the base of the ladder, his pistol aimed at the top. "Come on out, children," he cooed in a sickeningly sweet voice. "The old man can't help you now." Thomas took a steadying breath, the smell of gunpowder and pine filling his lungs. He was about to make his move when a new sound made his blood run cold. A soft, scraping sound. From the loft. William. A small object sailed through the air from above and landed with a clatter on the far side of the room, near the stove. Blackwood spun around, startled, and fired twice into the darkness where the sound had come from. It was the opening Thomas needed. He burst from behind the bed, lunging at Blackwood, using the rifle like a club. He brought the heavy wooden stock down hard across the sheriff's arm. There was a sickening crack. The gun clattered to the floor. Blackwood roared in pain and rage, but he was fast. He spun, his good arm lashing out, catching Thomas across the jaw. Stars exploded behind Thomas's eyes, and he stumbled back. The two men circled each other in the darkness, two predators fighting for territory. It was a brutal, desperate fight. Thomas was stronger, but Blackwood was younger, quicker, and fueled by a vicious greed. They crashed into the table, sending bowls and mugs smashing to the floor. Blackwood grabbed a shard of a broken mug, slashing wildly. Thomas felt a sharp, burning pain in his arm. He ignored it. He drove his shoulder into Blackwood's chest, sending them both crashing to the floor. They rolled, grappling, each man trying to get the upper hand. Thomas's fingers closed around Blackwood's throat. He squeezed, the years of anger and loss fueling his strength. But Blackwood was slippery. He writhed, his legs kicking out, and his boot connected with Thomas's wounded side. The pain was blinding. The old war wound screamed in protest. Thomas's grip loosened for just a second. It was all Blackwood needed. He shoved Thomas off, scrambling for the fallen pistol. His fingers closed around the handle just as Thomas lunged for him again. He was too late. Blackwood rolled onto his back, the barrel of the Colt pointing directly at Thomas's chest. A triumphant, evil grin spread across his face in the gloom. "End of the line, mountain man," he gasped. Thomas froze. It was over. He had failed. He had brought these children into his home only to lead them to their deaths. He closed his eyes, a prayer for Elizabeth on his lips. Then a new sound, the heavy metallic scrape of something being dragged across the floor. A small, dark shape darted out from under the table. It was Mary. She was dragging a heavy cast-iron skillet, her small face a mask of furious determination. Before Blackwood could react, she swung the skillet with all her might. Clang! The heavy iron connected squarely with Blackwood's gun hand. The shot went wide, blasting a hole in the cabin wall. The pistol flew from his numb fingers, sliding into the shadows. The sheriff screamed, clutching his shattered hand. That single moment of distraction was all Thomas needed. With a roar that was more animal than man, he surged forward, delivering a final brutal blow that knocked Blackwood unconscious. Silence descended on the cabin once more. It was broken by the sound of 3 small children scrambling down the ladder. They ran to him, not away. They wrapped their small arms around his legs, their faces buried in his worn trousers, their small bodies shaking with sobs of terror and relief. Thomas sank to his knees, his own body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He ignored the pain in his side, the sting in his arm. He wrapped his arms around them, pulling William, Sarah, and Mary into a fierce protective embrace. He held them tight, the 3 precious, impossible pieces of his broken heart, now somehow made whole. The fire in the hearth was long dead, but for the first time in 15 years, Thomas Morgan's house was filled with warmth, and it was finally a home. The sun rose on a scene of controlled chaos. Thomas had Blackwood tied securely to a chair, his confession mumbled through a swollen jaw. The man wasn't just a murderer. He was wanted in 3 other territories for robbery and claim jumping. His silver star was a sham, a tool to intimidate and deceive. When the real law finally arrived from the next county over, they looked at the grizzled mountain man, the 3 wide-eyed children, and the battered, trussed-up sheriff, and listened to the whole impossible story. The map was handed over. The location of the hidden gold was revealed. The government claimed the gold, of course, but they found that Blackwood's partner, the children's father, had filed a legitimate claim on the land. As his sole surviving heirs, a significant portion of the fortune was legally theirs. A finder's fee and reward was granted to Thomas as well. Suddenly, they weren't just a makeshift family, they were a wealthy one. Word spread through Timber Creek like wildfire. The story of the quiet mountain man who fought a killer to protect 3 orphans became the stuff of legend. Old Man Sullivan offered him supplies on the house for a year. The women from the church brought by pies and blankets. Thomas accepted their kindness with a quiet, grateful nod. But he knew his life was no longer in town. It was on the mountain. The seasons turned. Summer brought a riot of green to the high country. The cabin was repaired, expanded. A new room was added, with real beds for the children. Sarah's garden exploded with vegetables. William learned to fish and hunt with a skill that made Thomas's chest swell with pride. And Mary began to talk. She still had her moments of quiet, her knowing gazes at empty chairs. But now her words were filled with the simple, beautiful questions of a child. She laughed. She sang her strange, tuneless songs, and her favorite place in all the world was on Thomas's lap, listening to stories by the fire. The ghosts of the past hadn't vanished. Elizabeth's portrait still sat on the mantel, but now it felt less like a memorial to what was lost and more like a blessing for what was found. The children spoke of their parents now, not with terror, but with a sad, gentle remembrance. They were healing, all of them, together. One crisp autumn evening, as the leaves on the aspens turned to gold, Thomas sat on his newly built porch, watching the children play. The laughter that echoed through the trees was a sound he never thought he'd hear again. He went inside and returned with a small object in his hand. He walked over to Mary, who was collecting colorful leaves, and knelt beside her. "I have something for you," he said softly. He held out the small, perfectly carved wooden horse, the one he had made 15 years ago, for a son he never got to hold. Mary looked at the horse, then up at Thomas, her big dark eyes full of a wisdom that still sometimes took his breath away. She took the horse, her small fingers tracing its smooth sanded curves. "For me?" she whispered. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He could only nod. She smiled that luminous smile of hers, the one that had shattered his defenses from the very first day. She hugged the wooden horse to her chest. Then she looked him right in the eye, her expression clear and certain. "Thank you, Pa." He had made a promise to a child he had lost, a promise to be a father. He thought that promise had been broken forever, shattered along with his heart. But standing there on that mountain, with the setting sun painting the world in shades of hope, he finally understood. A promise isn't broken if it finds a new way to be kept. And a wound doesn't need to disappear to heal. It just needs to be filled with enough love to make you whole again. If you enjoyed this story of how a broken man and 3 lost children found their way home, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected. And let me know in the comments below, do you believe some connections are just meant to be?